Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short, and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
American policymakers increasingly claim to see an unprecedented level of collusion among China, Russia, and Iran. In this view, these three authoritarian powers coordinate their activities to support each other and undermine the interests of the United States. But do they? How aligned are the interests of Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran? And what level of actual policy coordination exists among them today? To discuss these questions, I'm joined by FPRI Senior Fellow Nick Gvosdev. Dr. Nick Gvosdev is the Director of the National Security Program at FPRI. He's also a Senior Fellow in the Eurasia Program and the editor of FPRI's Orbis, Journal of World Affairs. Gvosdev is a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He was formerly the editor of the National Interest magazine and a Senior Fellow at the Nixon Center in Washington, D.C. Gvosdev received his doctorate from St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. A frequent commentator on Russian and Eurasian affairs, his work has appeared in such outlets as Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, the Los Angeles Times, and Orbis, and he has appeared as a commentator on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and BBC. He's the co-author of U.S. Foreign Policy and Defense Strategy, The Rise of an Incidental Superpower, and the co-author of Russian Foreign Policy, Vectors, Sectors, and Interests. So, Nick, thanks for joining me today on Chain Reaction.
Glad to be here.
We're talking today about Russia, China, and Iran, which have variously been referred to as an axis of instability, an axis of authoritarians. Is it an axis? To what extent are they aligned? And if so, how are they aligned? On what issues?
Well, thanks for having me. And everything I'll be discussing here are my own personal opinions and perspectives on this matter. I think describing it as an alliance or an axis, which implies complete alignment, unity of purpose, is going a bit too far. The three countries are not allies to each other. They all describe each other as strategic partners. They describe, in the case of Russia and China, supposedly it's a strategic partner with a partnership without limits. But it's not an alliance. None of them have a mutual defense arrangement with each other that if one is attacked, the others must come to the defense of the one who was attacked or consult or take any steps. So I think it's important for us not to create the appearance of closer relations between these three states than actually exists. On the other hand, it's not insubstantial. It's not as if these are three separate countries and that they have no connection or relationship to each other. I mean, this is a good time when we can revive that good classic French term, entente, to describe the relationship between the three. They're not allies, but they do have a set of common geopolitical objectives, namely, each of the three see the United States as their principal barrier to achieving their geopolitical goals in the world. They resent or push back against the idea that the United States, usually in partnership with its European and Asian allies, can set the rules of the global system. And so they seek to revise, alter, in some cases abolish those rules. They all resent, to some extent, the continued dominance of the U.S. dollar and the fact that so much of global business runs through the United States' financial infrastructure, and they seek ways around that. So they have an incentive to partner with each other, to offer some degree of assistance to each other, and something that they have all identified as the basis of this common action is the perception that the United States, and to a lesser extent perhaps America's allies, but certainly the United States, if it could, it would seek changes of regime in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. And the extent to which the three of them then see spreading out the United States, distracting the United States in multiple theaters, that a United States which cannot concentrate all of its efforts in one area is one that can't bring its full weight to bear in any of these theaters. This is what Dov Zakheim described in Orbis a few years ago as what he termed Eurasian simultaneity, the ability to have multiple problems across the extended Eurasian realm, which requires the United States to split its attention and split its resources. And I think that what you've seen now is that within limits, the three countries are willing to work with each other to ensure that the United States has multiple distractions at the same time.
You said a couple of things there that that I jotted down. One is this idea that one of the main things they share is the perception that the United States it threatens their internal regime stability, and also a dissatisfaction with the role of the U.S. in the world, which they term often U.S. hegemony. And we've been called the binding agent, specifically in the Russia-China relationship. And every time I hear an American policymaker say we need to drive a wedge between Russia and China, I want to put my head in my hands because all we do when we insert ourselves into the equation is drive them closer together. So there's a discussion to be had that, what trajectory would the China-Russia relationship take if the U.S. were not a factor? Or what can we do to let it take a more natural trajectory rather than inserting ourselves into the situation and driving them closer together?
Well, this is something that both Vietnam and India within the last month are also very interested in this question of, for both Hanoi and New Delhi, a closer Russia-China relationship is not in their interests. They don't want to see China and Russia so lashed up together that it impacts them. And so Vladimir Putin's visit to Hanoi, Narendra Modi's visit to Moscow, both have this sense of two sort of other critical powers, one a rising major power, another a critical middle power in the Indo-Pacific, both having an outreach to Russia in the hopes that they can not stop the Russia-China entente, but at least preserve a certain degree of freedom of action for Russia, where Russia is not so beholden to China that it can't help both Vietnam and China in their efforts to counterbalance China. So the first step for Western policymakers, particularly for American policymakers, is the extent to which if we're not supporting these efforts, at least that we're not trying to prevent them. And we have seen over the last number of years, particularly in the Congress, a certain degree of understanding, surprisingly enough, about, say, India's relationship with Russia, that it's driven to some extent by a concern that a too close relationship between Russia and China is bad for India, and therefore the United States, while the United States is not going to drive this wedge, as you say, perhaps having other powers incentivize or sustain Russia's ability to be not so tightly connected to China is something that we're not going to perhaps criticize as much. And of course, we have, over the last number of years, we have soft pedaled our criticism of India's continued purchase of Russian energy, in part because we, I think, strategically recognize that it's good vis-a-vis our efforts in the Indo-Pacific to have India also have access to a regular supply of reasonably priced energy to keep its economy moving forward and to help it continue to act as that counterbalance to China. So I think that in some of this, we start moving into that multi-level game where the United States isn't really going to be splitting Russia and China, in part because the price that Russia would ask from us is one that we can't pay. We're not going to concede a Russian sphere of influence in Europe that would satisfy Moscow to the extent that then they might be willing to lessen some of that tie to China. But at the same time, having other powers, transactional relationships, the transactional 25, Turkey, India, and some Indonesia and some of the others perhaps working to lessen that Russia-China relationship may not be a completely bad strategic outcome from the U.S. perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we, of course, would then have to be sensitive, especially, I think, with India, to Indian perceptions of being perceived as an agent or an instrument of the U.S. But nevertheless, they have their own. In this case, Indian and American strategic interests seem pretty aligned in terms of the Russia-China relationship. Let me ask you about something else you mentioned in your opening remarks. You referenced the No Limits Partnership Statement, which, of course, Putin and Xi Jinping signed in mid-February, shortly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And many would say that that invasion has shown that there are indeed limits to the No Limits Partnership. So talk to me a little bit about how China and Iran have reacted to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that tells us about their relationship.
Well, it's important first to, as a starting point, that despite no limit partnerships between Russia and China, despite the strategic partnership between Iran and Russia, neither Tehran nor Beijing have ever recognized the annexation of Crimea. They don't recognize the transfer or annexation of the 4 regions of Ukraine to become part of the Russian Federation. So that's an important starting point. That was the first limit. The change that Russia did in the borders is not one that they recognize, and that their support is not automatic. What we've seen, both China and, China certainly, Iran much less at this point, but China still maintains economic ties with Ukraine. It has not written off the role that Ukraine might end up playing in Belt and Road. There are still Chinese investments in Ukraine, and China is not willing to foreclose those for Russia. China is not willing to exert itself to use its considerable economic power to extract any sort of concessions for Russia, particularly in its relationship with Europe. And China also, and we've seen this over the last number of years, China is not willing to just sort of provide large amounts of financial aid to Russia simply because Russia needs it. So what we've seen is the Chinese are not interested in bankrolling major new energy infrastructure, even though Russia would very much like to have more of that infrastructure constructed to divert energy sales to Asia. We've seen that Chinese companies, major Chinese companies, do not want to risk their markets in the United States by continuing to do business with Russia. So while it's not perfect, what we have seen is that China does allow sort of secondary companies to continue to do business with Russia, but that the major companies are not willing to cross U.S. sanctions. The U.S. market is still much more important to China than Russia's. The extent to which Russia is not yet willing, and it may come at some point, but Russia has not reached it yet today, where Russia would be willing to really sign over control over large swaths of its natural resource endowment to Chinese companies. That is to give them major ownership stakes and the ability to really set corporate policy. So from the Russian side as well, that there are limits, that all of what Russia has to offer is not necessarily being provided to China. In the case of Iran, certainly Iran is in a much stronger position vis-a-vis Russia now, because Iran is part of this, what they call Eurasian roundabout, that as Russia's direct transport and economic links with the West are being severed, much more of that is now going through Central Asia, the South Caucasus, Turkey, of course, playing an important role here. But that north-south route from Russia, especially to reach India and South Asia, running through Iran, gives Iran more leverage to be able to exercise. That the Iranian economy certainly is benefiting from the sales of drones and other technologies to Russia, and that Iran is gaining some valuable experience in seeing how its drones are performing in Ukraine, which, of course, bolsters its own position in the region. But at the same time, I think that as the Iranians have signaling, as the new president is cautiously signaling, Iran's relationship with Russia is still largely situational and opportunistic, and that if a better offer were to be forthcoming from the West on a variety of issues, Iran might be prepared to curtail or limit its relationship with Russia. So it's definitely, again, they're not allies, they're partners. There's a degree of opportunity and transactionalism, but it doesn't represent a permanent alignment. Now, as with Russia, Iran's price might be too high, what Iran would want for rupturing its relationship with Russia, but it does open an opportunity for the United States to press that suggestion and to see how far it might go.
Yeah, and as you certainly know, Iran just elected a new president, and at least the media narrative is he is the more the less hard line of the two options. And so, given that, is there space or opportunity to change the relationship with Iran? Of course, we also have an election here coming up, and I think. I guess the answer to that question also would depend on what happens here in November. But are we at a point where potentially the U.S. relationship with Iran could change enough that it would impact Iran's relationship?
Well, certainly. I mean, a lot of balls are in the air right now, so it's hard to make concrete predictions. Certainly, it's quite telling that Russia's relationship with Iran is largely conducted via the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards. And I think that will continue because there is a sense that the presidency, certainly during the days of President Rouhani, prior to President Raisi, was more open and more interested in a relationship with the West. It is an interesting thing whether or not you might have the parameters of a deal between Iran and the United States. And if that were to occur, that would really change the Iranian calculus. And I think the Russians are aware of that, and they're worried about that. They're worried about it not only because of the technical relationship between Iran and Russia, but also historically that Iran could, with the right degree of investment, could supplant or replace Europe's sort of consumption of Russian energy. And of course, the Russians benefited greatly from the sanctions on Iran in the 2000s and the 2010s because they were able to fill that market gap. But the same thing could happen in reverse now, that Iran that strikes a deal, comes out from under sanctions, would be able to sort of replace even further. I mean, Europe has already decreased its imports from Russia. But if more Iranian energy were to be made available, it would really cut into the Russian market. So Russia, in a way, has always had an interest that there be a degree of antagonism between the United States and Iran because it serves Russian interests. So I think the Russians will be watching this very carefully. And as you said, this is also going to depend very much on our elections, who's elected, who comes in, who forms the teams, and what would be the appetite for potential deals in 2025.
So we've talked Russia, China, and we've talked Russia, Iran. What we haven't talked in this axis is China, Iran. What's the state of that relationship? Is there anything there?
No, I think that that's often understated. And I think that's because we often have in our mental maps that China is East Asia and Iran is the Middle East, and somehow they don't really connect to each other. But that relationship is pretty critical. Obviously, it's a supplier of energy at various points. Iran competes with Russia in terms of how much energy China is absorbing. It is very much part of China's strategy to continue to build up the land connectivity between Iran to China through Central Asia. Chinese strategists are very well aware that China is still vulnerable to the disruption by the U.S. Navy of its maritime trade routes. So Iran is important as a back way to get Middle Eastern energy into China, if possible, through various land routes. But more importantly, China sees Iran as part of its foothold as it is moving more into becoming a player in the Middle East in a way that the United States was caught off guard a few years ago with the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran that occurred under Chinese auspices. The idea that China, as China becomes the trading partner of choice, the energy consumer of choice, the alternate to the U.S. For things the U.S. is unwilling or unable to sell in the Middle East, that as Chinese influence increases, then the idea that the Chinese can offer themselves as alternative mediators. Probably at this point, the Chinese are much less willing to wade into the Arab-Israeli question. I think they're happy to leave that in U.S. hands for the U.S. to have to deal with. But really in the Gulf area, you see this whole sort of Chinese strategy of trying to take Iran, and I think the relationship with Iran has been part of that, and now with the Gulf states and with Saudi Arabia, and to say you already have a linkage to the West. Now let's link all of you into this emerging Indo-Pacific, Asian economic and security order, that you're just as much Western Asia as you are the Middle East or the Near East from the U.S. and European perspective. So I think there Iran matters because of China's position. If you then connect that with China's continuing relationship with Pakistan, and you sort of see this West Asia strategy approaching, that China very much is part of that. And then when it connects to Turkey, to not forget the Turkish dimension of this. By the way, as all of this is developing, and this again gets back to the point about Russia, is that ultimately as these relationships develop, they also bypass Russia. So the idea that Russia sits as the key interlocutor that you have to go through, well, China has been working with Iran and others in this sort of middle corridor process to create a connection between the sort of Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific worlds in which Russia potentially is bypassed as well. So again, it reflects the fact that China's not putting all of its eggs in the Russian basket. And Iran is an important player in China sort of connecting to the West, its strategy of reaching out to the West in a way that bypasses Moscow.
Yeah, so you mentioned you touched on the situation in the Middle East and the war ongoing there. Two major wars going on in the world, one in Ukraine and one between Israel and in Gaza. So Iran, it clearly is involved in some way in everything that's happening. Doesn't appear to be directly involved. But we keep hearing about a potential escalation along Israel's northern border with Lebanon, which would bring in Hezbollah, which is an Iranian client. So how have Russia, China, and Iran reacted to the war in Gaza, the Israeli war in Gaza? And where are we likely to see this go in the future?
Well, the first thing that I think is very striking, and this again shows how Russia has been isolated by what it's been doing in Ukraine and how its dependencies on Iran have increased, is that traditionally, for the last 20 years, Russia forged a pretty strong relationship with Israel. It tried to balance its traditional ties with countries like Syria, its relationship with Iran, its outreach to Saudi Arabia. And really since October, the idea that Russia sort of is mediator or balancer between Iran and Israel has really gone away, and that Russia largely now is on the Iranian side of the equation. And that is very striking, especially given the close personal relationship between Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin. Given their, you may recall that not this time, but the previous election cycle in 2018, Netanyahu was the first foreign leader to congratulate Putin on his re-election. They traditionally had a pretty close and enduring partnership. That seems to have largely gone by the wayside. From the Russian side, of course, this, the Israeli or the Hamas strike into Israel and then the subsequent Israeli response have really been fortuitous. It took the attention off Ukraine. It has changed what appears on television screens around the world, which is not, the recent strike in Kiev on the children's hospital notwithstanding. Most of the images of war we see now come out of Gaza, not out of Ukraine. It changed the dynamic for the United States in terms of where should it allocate military assistance, given demands of these things. I don't think that the Russians have a particular ideological or geopolitical bent here, but I think they see this as a necessary distraction. The longer that Iran can continue to indirectly support movements, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the Houthis, that this creates problems for the United States. I think that the Russians have moved in that direction. One final thing on this, which I think is also important, and this is just my sort of gut feeling, but I think it's important to raise both with Iran and also with another problematic actor from the U.S. perspective, which is North Korea. I think that in Moscow, the decision has been taken that the acquisition by Iran of nuclear capabilities and the retention of such capabilities by North Korea is no longer a problem in Moscow's view. 15 years ago, in all of our Track 2 and Track 1.5 dialogues we would have between the Americans and Russians, we all would have common agreement. We don't want to see Iran having a nuclear weapon. We'd really like it if North Korea would give up or stop its nuclear weapons development. I think that whatever risk an Iranian or North Korean nuclear weapons program might be for Russia, the Kremlin has decided that those risks are manageable given the bigger problems those programs would pose to the United States. And that if the price of checkmating the United States is accepting, strengthening North Korea's nuclear program and encouraging Iran, if not to cross the nuclear finish line, to at least have all the components ready for a nuclear program, I think that the Russians, and again, it's a gut feeling, I can't point to any policy statements, but I think that the Russians have accepted that and said, we're not going to stop it, and it's America's problem now, let them handle it, for us to have to handle it.
How about the Chinese? I mean, how do they see that same issue? North Korea.
I think that the Chinese are more where the Russians were 10 to 15 years ago, which is they understand it's a problem for the U.S., but I think that the Chinese, like the Americans, would like a world in which there are fewer rather than more nuclear powers. I think that they very much would not mind a future world where there would only be two nuclear powers in the case of the United States and China, that even Russia's retention perhaps of nuclear capabilities isn't necessarily something that China has to stand for. But I think the Chinese are also concerned that as these programs continue, what it does for the regional neighborhoods, that they certainly don't want to see the proliferation of nuclear capabilities around in Asia. And of course, Bob, going back to a point you raised about the election, right, that depending on how the U.S. election goes, more countries might feel that having a nuclear, at least having the nuclear option, is something that they want to preserve if they think that the United States is going to be wobblier on security guarantees. So in that sense, I think China would not like to see the precedent of more countries joining the nuclear club because they can look at their borders and then see, well, how many more nuclear states are we going to be surrounded by?
In terms of how they look at international order or global order, you hear a lot about between Moscow and Beijing is that Beijing wants to rewrite the rules of the order to more accurately represent what it sees as its stature and its role in the world, and the Russians want to tear the whole thing down, destroy the whole thing, and they're not really that concerned about what comes after it. What's your sense of the accuracy of that characterization? And then what do you think Iran, as sort of a junior partner in this axis, what's their view of the preferred international order?
That's a great point, right? Because I would describe the Russian approach to the world now. 20 years ago, the Russians liked the idea of a G something world, right? Whether it was a G8 or a G20, as long as Russia was one of the Gs, and that you had a group of countries sort of regulating the international order. Today, I think Russia has embraced a G0. That the world, if they feel now that they're not going to be necessarily one of the Gs, and therefore, if that's the case, not necessarily that everything tears down, but that really a G0 world, that as Ian Bremmer coined it a few years ago, where there really isn't a single power setting the agenda or small group of powers setting the agenda, I think is where Russia is going. I think China is still in the mindset of G2, G3 type of world, that China and the United States, China, US, United States, or between blocks, that China sort of says, look, we will coordinate the BRICS, and the United States sort of coordinates the Euro-Atlantic world, and then the United States and China at the top level will kind of sort things out. So I think that is an important point of divergence. For Iran, I think the question is, they are still assessing, would they have in which of these would they have a better shot of achieving their objectives? In a G0 world or in a G2, G3, where China is one of the groups setting the agenda? And I think this is why, for both Iran, we certainly see it with India, and with North Korea as well, right? There is a certain tension where they certainly don't want the U.S. being the hegemonic power, but they also don't want to replace that hegemonic power with one emanating out of Beijing. So they're going to look for, if Beijing checks the United States, that's great, but it's a sign that Beijing is now beginning to sort of set rules that it defines, they're going to try to push back on that. So I think you'll see that calculus with Iran as well, of welcoming China's ability to checkmate the United States, but being wary of China displacing Washington as the premier rule setter for the 21st century.
Yeah, it's interesting how you started to answer the question about different views of China and Russia. Like a lot of people will say, look, the only thing they really agree on is U.S. hegemony is destined to erode and should erode. They're not in alignment necessarily on what replaces it, because, as you said, China. What I read often and hear often is China does have this G2 sort of mentality that it sees Washington as its only real sort of peer globally, and believes that most global affairs can be managed or should be managed between Beijing and Washington. Obviously, the Russians do not subscribe to that view, and that would be a significant thorn, I guess, in the relationship going forward, assuming that U.S. hegemony, if it ever existed, is declining and is being replaced by some sort of multipolar system. I think they have very, very different views on how many poles there are. The Russians see themselves as one, and I'm not sure that people in Beijing necessarily agree that Russia would be a pole.
And I think that in Beijing they would say, we don't want too many poles, right? Too many veto-wielding powers. And I think this has been something that's been consistent in Russian policy, that 20 years ago this was the outreach to France and to Germany, right, of, hey, you, France and Germany and Russia, we should sort of work together to counterbalance the United States and the Iraq War. was used as kind of the example for that. And today, I think Russia is saying to China, we'll work to counter the United States, but then Russia goes to Iran, to India, to Vietnam, to North Korea, to other global South powers and says, but you're all concerned about China as well. So while we're all kind of counter-checking the United States, we should all work together to, also be able to balance against China. And there is that fundamental tension in the relationship in how that works out and what happens moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really complex topic. These are two huge countries in a large country, three authoritarian regimes, but authoritarian regimes that don't operate exactly the same way, and with histories that are often sort of contentious, right? Russian-Iranian history has often been contentious. Russian-Chinese history, often contentious. So, I mean, a lot to digest here. We will see what happens in November here in the U.S. election and what effect that may have on the dynamic among these three powers and our relationship with them. And maybe for a future chain reaction episode, as you were talking, I was thinking of the shattered dreams of the Europeans that Russia could be integrated economically, and this sort of economic interdependence would foster a more responsible Russia. And there was a similar thought in U.S. policy communities for decades about China, that China was, hey, the liberal economic order is what made China rich. So clearly the behavior will change. Neither of those things has happened yet. Any sort of concluding thoughts on that topic?
Well, I think that's important to recognize that these were gambles. And at the time in the 1990s, they were not unfounded. I think we sometimes have a tendency to look back and say, well, it was a mistake. We should never have done it. At the time, in the 1990s, as you said, there were headwinds pushing us. We were seeing the impacts of trade, globalization. People were benefiting from it. It wasn't inconsistent to say the trend lines are looking good if we continue to move along this pattern of Europe integrating with Russia, China, and the United States integrating at a global level. Will we produce outcomes that are more beneficial? But having recognized that some of those assumptions have not panned out, it does require a fresh look at strategic assumptions, whether or not this means consolidating among the democratic powers, pulling supply chains back, rethinking about alliances, rethinking who the most critical partners of the United States are going to be. And I think that this is part of that conversation, and that transcends just one election cycle. When we look and say, well, who's the horse race for president? Really, we're entering into a new set of conditions, just as we did in the 1980s and the 1990s, where the past models under which we've operated may not be reliable guides for the future. So it's going to be important to really take that fresh look at all of this, rather than really spend a lot of time blaming who was right or who was wrong in 1999 about the way things were supposed to work out.
Yeah, that's a great point. We should have maybe empathy for policymakers of the past who couldn't foresee all the secondary and tertiary effects of decisions that seemed logical at the time, right? Well, Nick, this has been great. Thanks so much for joining me today on Chain Reaction. And
always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.